They stood her on a crate as if she were a thing, not a woman who'd buried her husband just 3 days before. The dirt on her hem was still red from the grave, but that didn't stop the whispers from the crowd gathering at the edge of Dunridge's trading post. Bryony kept her chin up, though every part of her trembled, from the weight of grief, from the humiliation of being auctioned off by her late husband's brother, and from the cold which bit through her threadbare dress. "Debts must be paid," Hal had barked, voice oily with self-righteousness as he shoved her forward. "And what better payment than what he left behind?" The townsfolk shuffled awkwardly, some looking away, others grinning with sick curiosity. Bryony thought she might faint, but then a heavy silence fell, one that pressed down even harder than the wind. A man stepped forward. Not just a man, a giant, towering, broad, with a battered hat pulled low and shoulders like boulders. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he carried more than just weight on his frame. She'd seen him once, this man with the silence and the scars, a figure who came down from the mountain only for supplies. The children whispered he could crush a skull with one hand. No one spoke to him, and he spoke to no one. But now, in front of everyone, he walked straight to the crate, pulled a handful of coins from a leather pouch, and slammed them down with a sharp metallic crack. Gasps rippled through the air. $3? Hal sneered. "You think she's worth 3? The man didn't flinch. He looked at Bryony, eyes dark under the brim, and said only, "She's mine." That was all. 2 words. But they silenced Hal, shamed the crowd, and broke something brittle in Bryony's chest. No one dared challenge him. Hal snatched the coins and stormed off. The giant reached out, not to drag her, not to claim her, but to steady her as she stepped off the crate. She expected him to speak again, to give commands, to take her hand. But he simply turned and began walking, leaving her to follow if she chose. And she did. Because in that moment, between his silence and the soft crunch of snow under his boots, something wordless passed between them. A kind of offering. He didn't take her arm. He didn't look back. But his pace matched hers, and his presence was the first thing in days that hadn't made her feel alone. By the time they reached his mule tied at the edge of town, Bryony realized no one had moved. They all still stood there watching, as if they'd seen a ghost rise and walk away with a woman the world had decided was no longer worth keeping. He didn't lift her onto the mule. He simply handed her the reins and started up the narrow trail toward the ridge. She followed, numb, confused, but held together by a thread of something strange and quiet. She was sold for $3, but what she'd been given instead didn't feel like ownership. It felt like a beginning. Bryony didn't ask where he was leading her, and the giant cowboy never offered a word. The trail curved sharply up the ridge, each step away from Dunridge feeling less like escape and more like erasure. Her hand stayed tight on the reins, the mule trudging behind the man who now, somehow, had laid claim to her with 3 silver coins and 2 simple words. He walked with a lumbering patience, never turning to check on her. Yet every time she slowed, so did he, as if the rhythm between them was wordlessly shared. Snow began to fall again, light flakes drifting past the trees like forgotten breath. Bryony thought about asking his name, but the quiet felt sacred, like any noise would crack it. Finally, near dusk, he stopped before a cabin half swallowed by pines. Its slanted roof groaned under snow, but the door stood firm, and smoke rose from a chimney like a welcome. He didn't knock, just opened it and stepped aside. Bryony hesitated only a moment before following. Inside, it smelled of cedar and ash, and something stewed low over the hearth. The heat wrapped around her like a blanket, making her realize just how frozen her fingers were. She stood trembling, unsure, until he motioned toward a wooden chair near the fire. she sat. He moved slowly but with practiced grace, removing his coat, hanging it on a nail, feeding the flames without speaking. She studied him now, this man with shoulders like boulders, thick brown hair tied back, hands scarred and dark with labor. He poured soup into 2 tin cups and set one gently in front of her. Hers had a dent on the rim. His had none. She watched him lower himself onto the floor near the fire. Not the table, not a chair, but the floor, like he didn't want to crowd her space. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. He nodded once and ate. She sipped the stew, felt it melt through her ribs. After minutes of silence and heat and snow hissing on the roof, she found her voice again. "Why did you take me?" He didn't lift his head. "You needed not to be left there." Bryony blinked, the way he said it, not as a savior, not as a rescuer, but like someone stating a fact, caught something in her chest. "You don't even know me." He looked up then. His eyes were dark but soft, with a tiredness that made her stomach twist. "You were standing like someone who'd been erased. I just saw you." Her eyes burned. She looked down into the cup. "No one's seen me in a long time." He said nothing more. The fire cracked. Outside, the world turned darker. She didn't know what to make of this cabin, this man, this silence that didn't suffocate, but somehow healed. After she finished, he rose, gathered her cup and his, rinsed them in snow water, and set them aside. Then he unrolled a second blanket beside the hearth, not next to hers, not across the room, but near enough she'd feel the warmth without fearing closeness. "You'll be safe here," he said, and that was all. He lay down fully clothed, one hand beneath his head. Bryony stayed sitting, too full of things she couldn't name to sleep. But as the fire died to coals and his breathing evened out, she whispered, "You still haven't told me your name." A long pause. Then, softly, "Kalen." She curled under the blanket, her bones still unsure of trust. But something in her heartbeat slowed. For the first time in days, no one expected anything from her. And for now, that was enough. Bryony woke before the fire, the air cold enough to sting her nose but not her heart. She'd half expected to find the cabin empty, as if the giant cowboy named Kalen had been some hallucination summoned by snow and grief. But he was still there, curled near the hearth with his back to her, boots still on, his slow breaths fogging slightly in the morning chill. She rose carefully, unsure if she was trespassing in a life she didn't deserve. Her boots made no sound across the floor as she stepped outside. The snow had paused, leaving the trees glazed and breathless. She stood on the porch, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself, and for the first time in weeks, no one yelled, no one touched, no hands reached for her, no voices demanded obedience or debt, just wind and pine and the echo of her own heartbeat. When she returned inside, Kalen was up. He had filled the basin with snow, now melting on the stove, and was sharpening a knife with such slow, meditative strokes she almost turned back. But then he looked up and nodded. No greeting, no question about where she'd gone, no assumption that she owed him anything for the shelter or food. "You sleep all right?" he asked, voice low and hoarse, like someone unused to speaking much. She nodded, not quite trusting her own. "Fire died early," she offered. "I didn't want to stoke it without asking." "If you're cold, make heat," he said simply, without judgment. She liked that. He didn't smile, but his stillness wasn't unkind. She moved toward the hearth again, crouched and fed in more kindling. When it caught, she felt proud. They didn't speak much after that. He made breakfast, more stew and flatbread, and again served her the dented cup, like he'd decided that one belonged to her. Afterward, he left the cabin with an axe over his shoulder, and she stayed behind. She swept the floor, refolded the spare blanket, and cleaned the tin dishes. It felt odd, doing it without being told. Around noon, he returned with firewood and a fresh cut of elk meat. He said nothing of where he'd gone. He didn't comment on the cabin being swept or the dishes stacked, but he placed a small birch branch beside her dented cup before turning to skin the meat. It looked like a flower. She said nothing either. The days passed like that. Silent offerings, simple kindness. He didn't touch her. Not a brush of hand, not a suggestive look. He spoke when needed, explained things like how to trap snowmelt or which logs burned hottest. He gave her space without coldness, attention without pressure. At night he laid his bedroll on the other side of the hearth and never moved it closer. Once, when she bent to sweep ashes, her hair fell loose, and he glanced up. She froze, but instead of staring, he simply said, "There's a comb on the shelf if you want it." She used it that night, staring at her reflection in the dull tin mirror, unsure what he saw in her. The bruises from Hal's last shove had turned green, the hollowness beneath her cheekbones still sharp. She didn't look like a bride. She looked like a ghost that hadn't decided if it should stay or leave. But in the cabin's stillness, something began to settle. Not safety exactly, more like neutrality. She wasn't wanted, but she wasn't discarded. She wasn't beautiful, but she wasn't mocked. She wasn't claimed, but she wasn't invisible. And for a woman whose name had been bartered alongside livestock just days ago, that was its own kind of miracle. It started with a chill that wouldn't leave her toes. Bryony had grown used to the cold curling beneath the doorframe and sneaking through the walls, but that night it crawled deeper, under skin and bone. Bone, where even the fire couldn't reach. She sat curled near the hearth, her hands around the dented tin cup, now empty of broth. Kalen noticed. He didn't ask if she was cold. He simply stood, took the old patchwork quilt from his bedroll, and walked it over to her. He held it out, didn't unfold it, didn't drape it over her. Just waited until she reached for it herself. That gesture, so simple, so restrained, tightened something in her chest. She took it, wrapped it around her shoulders, and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded, and returned to his cot without another word. But before he lay down, he removed his coat and tossed it over the log bench beside her, as if silently daring the cold to touch her again. The fire dimmed, but her thoughts burned brighter. That night, sleep came slowly. Her body was warm, but her mind roamed. Who was this man? Why had he let her stay without touching her, without asking anything? Was it pity? Was it loneliness? Or something else altogether? She rolled over once, then again, careful not to disturb the quilt, which now smelled faintly of cedar and smoke and something clean. Something like trust. In the early hours, she woke with a start. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the shutter. She sat up, heart pounding, the remnants of a nightmare slipping away. Across the cabin, Kalen stirred too, already half awake, already watching her. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded but didn't lie. "I was dreaming I was back in Hal's wagon, only this time he brought a buyer with a rope." Her voice cracked. "I tried to scream, but—" He sat up fully, arms resting on his knees. "No one's buying you now." It wasn't a comfort. It was a fact, and somehow that made it more powerful. She stared into the low embers of the fire, blinking against the sting in her eyes. "I know you didn't ask for company," she said finally. "You were probably just looking for lumber that day, not a half-starved widow." Kalen didn't smile, but something in his face softened. I was looking for wood, found you instead. Timber grows back. You don't. She didn't know what to say to that, so she reached out and adjusted the blanket tighter around herself, as if the weight of his words had made the air thinner. He stood and crossed to the fire, stoked it gently back to life, then returned to his cot. But before lying down, he added something else. If you're still cold, the cot's bigger than it looks. He didn't look at her when he said it, and his voice didn't change. It wasn't a lure. It wasn't coated in suggestion. It was an offering, plain and slow. Bryony looked at the space between them, the small fire, the quilt, the coat, the silence, and realized something. He wasn't inviting her into warmth. He was offering her a choice. For the first time in years, she had one. She didn't move. She didn't answer. She just whispered, "Thank you," again. And this time, she meant not just for the blanket, but for the space, for the restraint, for the fire he built without asking for heat in return. That night, the cold stayed outside, and the blanket between them felt less like a barrier and more like a bridge. The sun rose slowly, pouring gold through the tiny cabin window until it kissed the floorboards and reached Bryony's bare toes. She'd fallen asleep, still wrapped in Kalen's quilt, her back against the wall, one hand resting over her heart as if guarding the slow thawing that had begun deep within. Kalen was already outside. She could tell by the silence. No heavy breaths, no creaking wood from the cot, only the distant sound of logs being split with steady, purposeful rhythm. She stood, folding the blanket with care and placing it neatly at the foot of his cot. Her feet moved stiffly, the bruises from her fall days earlier still fresh under the skin, but she didn't wince. She made her way outside where the scent of pine sap and wood smoke greeted her like a forgotten song. He was there by the tree line, shirtless, arms glinting with sweat and sawdust, chopping wood with the calm of a man who didn't need to prove his strength to anyone. For a moment, she simply watched. How his muscles worked without strain, how his breath stayed even, how his eyes flicked up to her just once, and then returned to the task. "You braid your hair every morning?" he asked, without looking up again. She blinked, caught off guard. "I used to. My husband didn't like it." He didn't say anything to that, but he paused his chopping and set the axe against the stump. He walked over and sat on the edge of the porch, patting the space beside him. She hesitated, then came, sitting down slowly, the cool air catching in the hem of her dress. He reached behind him into the small pouch at his belt and pulled out a leather cord. "May I?" he asked, eyes not searching hers, just waiting. She swallowed. No man had ever asked to touch her hair like that. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't dominance. It felt like reverence. She nodded. Slowly, he reached for the end of her unbraided strands and began to separate them with a gentleness that belied his size. Each movement was careful, practiced. "My mother was Lakota," he said. "She said braiding is a way of speaking, past, present, and future woven together. You wear your strength behind you, not in front." The wind shifted, brushing a few leaves across the yard. Her eyes stung with more than cold. "No one's ever told me that," she whispered. "Hal used to pull it to keep me in line." Kalen's fingers stilled for a moment, then resumed. "Then every knot I tie today unknots what he did," he said simply. It wasn't a promise. It was an action, spoken through touch. She closed her eyes. For the next several minutes, there was only the sound of birds, wind, and the occasional soft flick of hair slipping through strong fingers. When he was done, he didn't say, "There." He didn't ask her to look. He just handed her the leather cord and waited. She tied the braid off herself, hand steady. And for the first time in years, her hair didn't feel like something that dragged behind. Her. It felt like something she carried forward. Kalen stood and returned to the stump without ceremony, lifting the axe like nothing had changed. But everything had. When she went back inside, she saw something on the wall she hadn't noticed before. A carved wooden plaque shaped like a bird with its wings folded, small but careful. She traced it with her fingers. Then she took a strip of cloth, tied her braid off again, and whispered into the quiet cabin, "I'm still here." Outside, the axe paused mid-swing. The next morning broke strange and still, the kind of quiet that made the birds forget their songs and even the wind hold its breath. Bryony opened her eyes before dawn, drawn from sleep not by sound, but by the sense of something missing. Kalen wasn't in the cabin, though the embers still pulsed warm in the hearth. She stepped outside, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and scanned the tree line. No movement. The woods looked like they were carved from ash, frosted, pale, waiting. Then she spotted him. He was standing barefoot in the clearing beyond the coop, one hand on a tree trunk, as if listening to it. A rabbit hung limp in the other hand, freshly caught. He wasn't hunting. He was watching, guarding. Bryony approached slowly, careful not to disturb the stillness that seemed to coat everything in a layer of invisible glass. "Something wrong?" she asked softly. He didn't turn around. "Tracks, fresh, not bare." A shiver ran up her spine, not from the cold. "Human?" she asked, though she already knew. He nodded. "More than one, at least 3. Heavy boots, one with a dragging limp." She sucked in a breath. Hal had a limp from that bar fight in Prenton 2 winters ago. "My brother-in-law," she said. Kalen finally turned to face her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, scanning her for something deeper than panic. "They'll come at night," he said. "Cowards prefer shadows." He handed her the rabbit. "Skin this. You'll need the strength." She took it with shaking hands. I don't know how." He tilted his head. "Then you'll learn. Today." He stepped past her toward the cabin, and she followed, rabbit held stiff in her arms like a child unsure whether to be grateful or horrified. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Kalen checked the snare lines, moved the coop closer to the cabin, reinforced the back door with 2 iron rods, and nailed shut the window that faced the forest. He dug out a short rifle and a smaller pistol and laid them on the table beside a sack of bullets and a wedge of smoked meat. Bryony, under his wordless instruction, learned quickly how to gut a rabbit, where to stack kindling, how to whistle low if something came from the east side. Her braid stayed tight behind her, but her fingers moved like a different woman's. At dusk, he built a second fire behind the cabin, far enough to draw attention away from the main structure. "False glow," he said. "They'll go to it first if they're fools." She stood by the hearth, watching him slice onions with a hand too calm for the storm ahead. "Why are you doing all this for me?" she asked. "You could just walk away." He looked up slowly. "I don't walk away from people who are still standing." She blinked hard. He set the knife down, came to her, and placed one calloused hand over hers. "You still think you're the woman who stood on that crate," he said. "But you're not. Not anymore." Outside, the wind began to howl, rattling the shutters. He leaned in close and whispered, "Let the storm come. We've already lit the fire." And for the first time since her husband's death, Bryony felt something close to steady, not safe, but grounded, like a tree bracing for winter, but with roots deeper than she realized. They ate in silence, the rifle near the door, the storm closer than ever. They came just after midnight, as Kalen had said they would, though it wasn't shadows that warned Bryony. It was silence. Too silent. Even the wind had stopped, like the forest itself was holding its breath. She was at the hearth, tending the flame with shaking fingers, when the faintest creak of wood came from the far side of the cabin. Her heart jumped, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she looked to Kalen, who was already on his feet, rifle in hand, body still as a statue carved from the mountain. He motioned once, down, and she obeyed, crouching low by the bed with the pistol he'd shown her how to load earlier. Then came the voices, low and slurred with liquor. "This the place?" "Dunno. I see smoke." "Let's get it done, boys. She ain't worth all night." Hall Bryony would know that rotten drawl anywhere. Her stomach turned. Kalen didn't speak. He stepped slowly to the side window and peered through the edge of the shutter. Then, faster than she'd seen him move before, he turned and grabbed the small log from beside the fire, doused it in oil, and hurled it out the back window. Within seconds, the false campfire lit up behind the shed, its glow flickering like a trap made of flame. "They'll think it's us," he whispered, "until it's too late." Bryony could barely breathe. Her whole body trembled, not just from fear, but from the terrifying certainty that this man, this so-called beast in a cage, was willing to risk everything for her. A crack of brush outside, footsteps, then shouting. "There! I see the fire! Go around, flank 'em!" But the cabin stayed still. Bryony held her breath. Then a second sound. Quieter. Closer. The front porch creaking. Someone testing the door. She clutched the pistol tighter. Kalen nodded at her once, the kind of nod that said if this was the end, they'd meet it upright. A boot kicked the door. "Bryony," Hal's voice slithered through the crack. "Come out now, and I might not gut him too." Silence. Then another voice. Reed, the smaller brother. "We can set it on fire, Hal." "No," Hal hissed. "There's value in her alive." Bryony's breath caught. Rage filled her, hotter than fear, heavier than grief. Her fingers stopped shaking. Kalen's eyes were on the door, but he said nothing. Another crash. This time a shoulder. The wood held. Barely. Then it happened. Kalen moved. Fast, brutal, silent. He threw the door open mid-charge, caught Hal by the throat before the man could scream, and dragged him into the dirt like an offering to the earth. A gunshot rang out. Bryony flinched. But it wasn't Kalen who fired. She didn't even know if he was armed in that moment. All she saw was him, crouched over Hal, one fist buried in the man's collar, voice low and dark as a storm. "You sold her like cattle. You're not walking away." Another shot. Reed screamed and ran. Kalen didn't chase him. He just stood there, over Hal, as the man whimpered beneath the weight of justice that had waited too long to arrive. Bryony stepped out onto the porch, gun still in hand, the wind wild around her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Kalen looked up at her and said, "Go back inside. I'll finish this." She didn't argue. She turned, she walked. And behind her the fire still burned. The dawn came slow and blue, filtering through the cracks in the shutters like the breath of something holy, something reborn. Bryony sat at the edge of the bed, her hands cupped around the tin mug Kalen had handed her, steaming with boiled pine needle tea. She hadn't spoken much since the night, not because she couldn't, but because silence felt sacred now. Kalen had returned before sunrise, blood on his knuckles and smoke in his beard, his voice even quieter than before. He hadn't told her what he did with Hal or the others. She didn't ask. What mattered was that the threat was gone. and for the first time since her husband's death, the weight on her chest had lessened. Kalen sat across from her now, whittling something small and smooth between his palms. His hands, large and calloused, looked like they'd been carved from tree trunks, yet he held the knife like a brush, shaping the wood with surprising tenderness. She stared at those hands, how they'd fought for her, built for her, protected her, and suddenly a tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it fast. He noticed anyway. "Sorry," she murmured. Don't be sorry," he said, setting the carving down. "Not for tears. Not here." Bryony swallowed. "You saved me." "No," he replied. "You saved yourself. I just cleared the path." For a long moment, they sat at the quiet. Then he reached for something behind him and pulled it into the light. A new pair of leather shoes, sturdy and soft-lined, stitched with care. "They're not perfect," he said, "but they're yours." She blinked. Her hands trembled as she took them, fingertips brushing his. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything." He reached for the second shoe and set it beside her. "Just put them on when you're ready to leave the past behind." She looked down at her burned, bandaged feet. The shoes were a kindness she never expected. But the gesture, it was something else. A rite, a door opening. "I don't even know your name," she whispered suddenly, the realization hitting her like a gust. "Kalen," he said. "Kalen Ridge." He waited a beat. "And you?" "Bryony. Bryony Talbot," her voice caught. "I suppose now I'm just Bryony." He studied her, then said very softly, "Not if you don't want to be." She looked at him, startled. "What do you mean?" "You came to me with fire and frost in your eyes," he said. "You didn't ask for rescue or pity. You asked for shelter. You asked for choice. I can't give you the world, Bryony, but I can give you a name to stand under. One that means safety. One that means home." The room went still. Her breath hitched. She wasn't sure if it was an offer or a proposal, or simply a gesture of belonging. But either way, it hit her deeper than she'd expected. "And what name is that?" she asked. He reached for her hand and held it with both of his, warm and steady. "Mine," he said, "if you want it." For a moment she couldn't speak. Then she nodded. Just once. And in that tiny nod, the past cracked and let light through. Kalen didn't smile, not really, but the corner of his mouth lifted just barely, as if he'd known all along this day would come. She set the mug down, slipped her feet into the shoes and whispered, "Then let's begin again." The trail above the ridge had thawed just enough to reveal the old creek bed path, a winding trace between evergreens and rock that only Kalen seemed to know by instinct. Bryony followed him with cautious steps, the new shoes molding to her feet like they'd always been waiting for her. The wind up here was clean and cold, brushing the hair from her face as if the mountain itself were inspecting her, deciding what to make of this woman who now bore no man's name, but was choosing a new one. She glanced up at Kalen's broad back, the long rifle strapped behind him, the quiet confidence in his stride. He hadn't said where they were going. He hadn't needed to. She trusted him. That alone astonished her. Somewhere behind them, her old life lay frozen beneath Hal's shadow, beneath debts and death and names spoken with shame. But here, ahead, lay something unfamiliar and raw. Possibility. The trail narrowed, and Kalen slowed to offer his hand. She took it, heart pounding, not from the climb, but from the heat of his palm and the way he glanced back to make sure she was all right. Not once had he pulled her forward. Not once had he dragged her out. He'd simply waited, step by step, as she walked toward whatever this was becoming. At the crest, he paused. The trees parted like curtains and the world opened. Below, the whole valley stretched, blanketed in snow but laced now with veins of green. The first pulse of spring. "This is it," he said. "My father brought me here when I was a boy. Said if I ever found someone who made the silence feel full, this was the place to bring her." Bryony stepped beside him, breath catching. "It's beautiful." "It's yours," he said. "If you want it." "You'd give this to me?" "No," he said softly. "I'd share it. You don't belong to anyone, Bryony, but if you choose to belong somewhere, let it be here." She stared out at the land. It was wild and imperfect, just like her. She could see where storms had broken trees, where animals had carved their paths, where life had survived winter with teeth and silence. And still, it was alive. "I don't know if I can start over," she whispered. "You're not starting over," Kalen replied. "You're continuing. You're just doing it with someone who sees you." A hawk cried high above, circling once before vanishing into the horizon. Bryony turned to him then. "Why me?" she asked. "Why not some woman without a past, without burns and bruises and ghosts?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her feet, then her hands, then her eyes. "Because I've seen what the world does to women like you," he said. "And I've also seen how you stood tall when it tried to bury you. That kind of strength isn't something I pity. It's something I want beside me when the next storm comes." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she reached for his hand. He let her. And there, on that quiet mountain ledge, neither of them said what they felt. Not fully. But it lived in the silence between them, echoing off stone and sky. The wind picked up, lifting the hem of her coat, wrapping it around his side as if trying to pull them closer. And maybe it did. For a long time they just stood like that. Two souls stitched back together by wilderness and witness. By the time they descended the ridge, the sky had begun its slow bloom toward dusk, the kind of gold that kissed the snow and turned it forgiving. Kalen led the way back to the cabin, the same one she'd once entered shivering, with a wedding ring tucked in her boot and a past too heavy to carry. Now she walked beside him, not behind, her breath even, her hands steady. Bryony glanced at the porch as they approached, where the blanket he'd once draped over her still hung to dry. It smelled like cedar and smoke and safety. Inside, the fire had burned low but not out. Kalen never let it die entirely. She moved without instruction, feeding it carefully, coaxing the embers until they sparked back into flame. The room glowed as if it remembered them. He began unpacking the satchel of goods they'd bartered for earlier in town. Salt, flour, coffee, a spool of thread she'd picked up and tucked in without a word. "You gonna finally fix that hem?" he teased, and for the first time in months she laughed out loud. "No," she said. "I'm going to leave it torn. It reminds me I made it through." He paused, then nodded, his face warm in the firelight. She took a step closer. "You've never asked what I want, Kalen." "Because I don't want to shape your answer," he said. "But I do want to hear it." She looked around the room, at the chair he'd carved, the shelf with her shawl folded beside his boots, the kettle he always left full in case she woke before him. "I want this," she said. "Not just the walls or the fire. I want the way you look at me when I think no one does. I want the quiet. And I want the hard days, too, if they come with you." He took her hand then. No ceremony, no permission sought, just a shared breath between them, and turned it over, studying the fingers she'd once hidden. "You're not a thing to be owned, Bryony," he said. "But if you choose to stay here, you'll never have to doubt where you belong." She felt it then. Not love like a spark, but like a slow-burning flame that had been warming her all along, waiting for her to feel safe enough to step toward it. "I never wanted a new name," she whispered, "but I think I want yours. Not because I need it, because I want to wear it like this cabin wears the snow, quiet, steady, chosen." He brought her hand to his lips, kissed the rough edge of her knuckle. "Then it's yours," he said. "You can keep it, or leave it, or paint it above the door. Just know, it was never meant to trap you, only to welcome you." That night, they ate bread still warm from the hearth, their knees touching beneath the table. When he stood to refill her cup, she noticed he'd set 2 spoons by the pot before sitting down. Without thinking, without planning, as if she had always been expected, as if her place had never been a question. Later, when she pulled the blanket up around her shoulders and stared at the fire flickering against the log walls, she realized the ache in her chest wasn't fear anymore. It was peace, earned, not given, chosen, not forced. And when Kalen reached across the bed just once to lay his hand over hers, she didn't flinch. She simply turned her palm to meet his. The fire beside them crackled softly, but it was nothing compared to the fire she had chosen inside herself. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more soul-deep stories here on Echoes of the West. If you'd stood there when he offered his name, would you have taken it too? Tell us in the comments.